Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. Some people ask, so I'm going to answer this very quickly before I start the map update. How much troops there are in Ukraine? Russian troops, obviously. Right now, there are about 330,000 troops of Russians inside of the occupied territory of Ukraine. Additionally, Russia had 100,000 troops that were additionally training inside of Russia, and now they are already pushing them into the occupied territory. So it seems Russia is preparing for a big offensive at the start of February to February, March, and so on. So basically, Russia is already scaling up slowly but surely their, I don't know, it's technically it's winter still, but let's call it spring offensive because everyone talks about this as a spring offensive. So what we expect from that? First and foremost, that the current coming months will be very hard because Ukraine is on defensive. We know how Ukraine defends. So for us as observers, this will be a challenging time. Obviously not as challenging as for Ukrainians on the ground, but it will be challenging in a sense that we will see that the Russians are gaining territory here and there. So for us, the important thing to know is how much territory Russia is gaining. A proper offensive, like an offensive tempo, is usually discussed around 20 and more kilometers per day. If essentially army can take 20 kilometers per day, that's a very good offensive. So if it's about 10 kilometers, we can say that it's like they're not really doing that hot. So our main measure, basically, let's give a slack to Russian army and let's forgive everything and say, okay, Russian army is going to be slow, but they're going to push Ukrainians, and that's going to be like this. So we're going to set the bar at 5 kilometers per day for the Russian army advance. So we'll need to see how this attack that Russia now is sending in troops are going to start developing. And essentially, we'll need to do two things when we're counting these 5 kilometers. We will need to look for where is the main thrust of attack. So far, it seems that the main thrust is around the Donbas region, but it also might be on the south side or the north side. We don't really know yet because the bulk of Russian troops are kind of still moving behind the defense lines. With that said, let's finally go to the map update. And we're going to go into details quite a lot today. Firstly, Novoselyevsk. As I said, Russia is starting to attack and they are starting to send troops. So the expectations was that Ukraine is having better positions and they were expected to push towards Novoselyevsk and take out kind of the high ground over Svatove. However, with Russia sending in reinforcements, the situation changed. And now it was Russia that tried to attack from Kozyemivka towards Novoselyevsk. However, it didn't really go that well for Russians because the attack is a little bit up the hill from Kozyemivka. Kozyemivka is kind of a little bit on the lowland here. So when they're trying to attack to Novoselyevsk, it's actually a lot more favorable position for Ukrainians. And so far, all of these counterattacks have been failing. And we actually know that Ukrainians are also doing their counter push. So the line is going to be standing still for a while because there's still a lot of Russians and they are having essentially the offensive happening right now. And the same is happening around Kreminna, except a little bit more success for Russians. We actually have video now showing, firstly, that they have entered Dibro. So Dibro is still contested. They haven't captured it. You know why I know it? Because Russians haven't told about this. They would tell you about capturing any kind of small toilet or whatnot. And secondly, we've seen videos from the area, from like forest areas, where Russian troops are riding essentially somewhat fresh vehicles that are driving in columns, like so the proper columns and so on, through the forests and so on. So they are definitely like, you know, reinforcements arriving. It's not the troops that been fighting there for some time now. They're like it's we see some actual fresh troops in the area. Therefore, we can definitely understand that Russia realizes just how important Kreminna is, and they don't want to give it back. Otherwise, there are some fights around Chirvona-Popivka, but overall, remember, Ukraine is going to be on defensive, so if the line doesn't move towards Ukrainian positions, it is a victory for Ukrainians. So we heard that Ukrainians finally admitted that they have left Solidar, and this doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I've been telling you for a while now, but Russians are still being targeted on the west side of Solidar here. So it is really becoming like a slaughterhouse, though to a lesser extent, because right now the troops have been retaking other positions. So Krasna Hora and Paraskoviivka, these are two last points essentially that defend the northern road for Bakhmut. This is of course relevant because the southern part is a little bit in trouble. So we have Klishivka here, and I've told you that the more important last video is the hills over here. After I released the video, there was sharing of some of the videos from the fighting around Klishivka, and I already saw that Russians were inside of the trenches on the positions that I was discussing in these. So my expectations was that as Russians were able to reach these positions, they will just continue sending their waves and waves and waves of human flesh, and they will eventually capture it. And this is how I still think, like, because Russia is having advantages in force here, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. So, but it seems the last couple of days have not been that successful for the Russians. And despite them coming into these positions, it does not seem that it's coming to them easily. So we definitely know that Ukrainians have pushed them out of these positions a little bit. And these couple of days, they have been regrouping and trying to figure out how to approach this again. All in all, I think the situation for Bakhmut is becoming really complicated. One of the roads is already not used by Ukrainians. It is this road through Ivanishka. It's not a big secret, so this road doesn't exist. It's already being shot at. So what Ukrainians are doing instead is they're using the road through Kromove. So they are going through Ivanivsky here and to Kromove to Bakhmut. This is the road they're taking. It's not a highway, but it's good enough to be supplying Bakhmut. Otherwise, there is also this road of supplies to Bakhmut. So despite the main roads being hit, being here and here, even if those two are taken, there is still enough essentially supply possibilities for Bakhmut, so Ukrainian troops can keep fighting, but at that moment they should already start considering their retreating options. So far, Bakhmut is holding by a thread, but it's still more or less okay. I cannot say it's fine anymore, unfortunately, because the Klishivka position is very compromised, and we already know that the situation around Krasna Hora and Paraskoviivka are also being complicated. And the main point about Bakhmut, I want to say it's in the sense that we understand it very clearly. It's not that Bakhmut does not matter. That's not important, because the idea that certain things, like if they're lost, that didn't matter at all, it would be a little bit of dishonest. Like, for example, if Bakhmut falls, it's gonna be problematic for Ukraine, right? Because then they will need to recapture it. It's a very good fortification town. It's a good place. It had a lot of good supply roads. It had a lot of good positions. What I want you to put in perspective is I want you to rewind the YouTube videos 6 months ago, maybe, and look at the news that were discussed 6 months ago. Because 6 months ago, the situation was as follows. Firstly, Izium was still under Russian control. And what essentially everyone was drawing on the map, they're saying, okay, so Russia is now coming off Popasna. Ukrainians have retreated from Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. Now they will just quickly go and circle Bakhmut, and then Ukrainians need to figure out how will they defend Sloviansk and Kramatorsk line. Bakhmut at discussions back then was not really even discussed as a proper fortification town. It was just a bump on the road to Kramatorsk and Sloviansk for Ukrainians. So that's why basically to verify my things, what I'm saying, I just advise you to look up those videos 6 months ago. With that said, obviously, if the Bahamut Falls, that's not a very nice thing to have, but this is not the end of the world. That's the most important thing that I want you to get. And as I'm saying, Russia right now is on the attack. We'll need to see how fast they will be advancing, but the key thing for us to be aware of is how much resources does Russia use in order to advance forward. If the advancing tempo is too slow, or Russia is using too much resources, that is going to be terrible for the Russian. We need to understand that Bakhmut has paid for itself many times over, right? The bump in the road that was supposed to be just a thing that they go to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk has turned into some kind of actual, almost unbeatable achievement for Russian forces. And that is something we need to be very, very clear upon. Quickly covering Avdiivka, Marinka, the situation is about the same, but what is most important is what's happening on the south. Vuhledar is happening right now, and I'm going to get back to it just a second. But what was happening essentially is that Russians started this offensive all across the southern line, and all of the Russian media reporters, they started yelling, wow, big offensive, so much success, we breached the Ukrainian positions and already pushing them back. After a day, it turned out that was like the fighting was still going on, and then after that, it turned out that they achieved absolutely nothing. And the only thing that we got was a plethora of videos of Russians being decimated. And right now, they still haven't achieved anything on the south side. And there is Vuhledar. So around Vuhledar, the situation is very, very interesting because here is Russians were able to secure Pavlivka, and Russian was able to secure Mikilske. And Mikilske here, they've leveraged to kind of get themselves to attack from the east side towards Vuhledar. So on their first attack points, they were essentially able to reach this part of Vuhledar, and there is like a small part of the settlement here. After which Ukrainians counterattacked, and they were able to push Russians essentially back to the line around this, I don't know, this is not really a river, like let's say like a water storage, whatever. And the problem is that this area over here, if you can see, between the houses and everything that is over here, the area where until Ukrainian positions, where the arrows are, this is a death field. This is where now there is so many videos coming from. It's a completely open zone. Ukrainian artillerymen are very good at almost every square meter on that. And this is where we get all those crazy videos with tanks burned right next to each other, all of their equipment being burned. The problem of Russia is not even like capturing Vuhledar right now, but the problem is just getting to Vuhledar. They are really struggling to get towards the city. And even if they can get to one part of the city, they cannot really get to the other one because their reinforcements still need to cross this field, and they just get decimated again and again and again. I'm expecting them to drop essentially the usage of armored vehicles in the same way that the Wagnerites did, and just use small groups as human waves. This will cost a lot of human lives, but then again, those are Russians, so who cares? Anyway, love you all, guys. This is it for today. Just a map update. And I will see you tomorrow when I will be talking about tanks and everything. Slava Ukraini!